Not sure how you did that, Ephraim. You started in chapter 1 and finished in chapter 50. So, not chapter 50, it's Exodus. What is it, chapter 40? No, it was Exodus 1 and then you came to Genesis 50. So, if you're not sure, the reading was from Exodus chapter 1. Welcome to everybody today. It's really good to see various visitors, new faces with us, and we appreciate you coming our way. Also, happy Mother's Day to all you mothers who I'm told are being taken out to restaurants in various places and being looked after today and so forth. So I hope you have an enjoyable day. Let me go back some years. My father was born in April 1936. He was born in East London in England and spent his early years there. But on September the 3rd, 1939, Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced that Britain was at war with Germany. And I remember my grandmother many years ago saying how she listened to the radio broadcast of that announcement. I think it was a Sunday morning. The widespread view at that time was that Germany would heavily bomb Britain and that Britain would be unable to resist the attacks. London had been bombed during the First World War and it was expected again in 1939. And the government was acting on the basis that many people in Britain and particularly London would die. In fact, a government report predicted that 450,000 Londoners would die as a result of German bombing in the early stages of the war, and that an additional 1 million people would be wounded. And indeed, warehouses in various places were filled with coffins ready for that. Now, as it turned out, those expectations, those estimates were far too high, but that was not known at the time. And in reality, in the Blitz in 1940 and 1941, 43,500 civilians were killed in Britain by bombing, and a lot more were killed by the end of the war. In fact, my father at one stage was back in London later in the war, and he was blown across a room when a V1 rocket bomb landed a street away. So faced with all of these threats and these fears, my grandmother took my father and headed north, higher up England. As it turned out, there would be bombing there as well. But what my grandmother did for her son has been done countless times by mothers throughout history. Mothers care for their children and often go to great lengths to protect them. And there's various examples of this in the Bible. For instance, here in the book of Exodus, we read of the birth of Moses over in Exodus chapter 2. He was born possibly around 1,520 years BC. And that being so, it was about 350 years after the Israelites entered Egypt in the form of Jacob and his family. But as the Israelite population grew, Egyptian leaders came to see the Israelites as a threat. And so they turned against the Israelites, and an Egyptian Pharaoh planned to exterminate them. And that's what we saw in Exodus chapter 1 in verse 16, where the Pharaoh says to the midwives, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and to see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, you will put him to death, but if it is a daughter, then she shall live. And then further down in verse 22, Pharaoh later says to the people, every son who is born you are to throw into the Nile, but every daughter you will keep alive. And of course, that was a way of wiping out the Israelite population over a period of time. But there was a couple named Amram and Jochebed, and they had children. In fact, they had 2 sons and also a daughter, the daughter being Miriam and the 2 boys being Aaron and Moses. And they, like every Israelite family, faced a challenge. How do you keep a baby from crying? Or how do you hide that crying when there are people looking for male infants to kill them? How do you keep the children quiet as they grow up and their inclination is to pray? And so Jochebed, as a mother, like many other mothers there, had to deal with this situation. And she came up with a plan, and I'm not sure what she had in mind with this plan, but all we can say is that the plan, by God's grace, did work. Exodus chapter 2, verse 2, the woman conceived and gave birth to a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. That phrase there, that he was beautiful, is also translated that he was good of form. Verse 3, when she could no longer hide him, she got him a papyrus basket, covered it with tar and pitch, in other words, to waterproof it. And then she put the child in it and set it amongst the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Now the reeds would hold the basket there to prevent it sailing away on the current. Again, what did she have in mind exactly? I don't know, but we do know that a daughter of Pharaoh, an Egyptian princess, found the baby, and Moses was raised as an Egyptian, and you know what goes on from there. But the point here is that you had a mother whose child was threatened, and she did something to protect him. And there are various other examples of the same sort of thing. For instance, we can go back to Genesis chapter 21 and there read verses 9 to 12. I won't always be reading whole sections of it, but you might remember that Abraham married Sarah, but for a long time they were unable to have children. And this was despite the fact that God was promising that they would indeed have many descendants. Well, Sarah in the end tried to resolve this herself, and so she gave her maidservant Hagar to Abraham as a second wife, and through Hagar, Abraham fathered Ishmael. But still, God indicated that Ishmael would not be the son of promise. And so, in the course of time, God enabled Sarah to conceive, and she gave birth to Isaac. And Isaac, of course, was the son of promise. But as Isaac grew older, so Sarah turned against Hagar and against the son Ishmael. And you read, for instance, from Genesis chapter 21 and verse 8, the child grew, this is the child Isaac, and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking Isaac. Therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. Now you might say, well, that's just jealousy. That's Sarah being jealous on behalf of her son Isaac against Hagar's son Ishmael. But there is something a bit more to it than that, because we go back to Genesis chapter 17 and read there from verse 15, and this is sometime earlier. Then God said to Abraham, as for your wife Sarah, you shall not as for your wife Sarai, you shall not call her by the name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, give birth to a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. But God said, no, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. Isaac was the one through whom God would carry out his plans. And so later, after the birth of Isaac, when Ishmael is ridiculing Isaac, then Sarah takes a stand for her son Isaac. And this is not just jealousy, but rather remember, this is the one through whom God is going to carry out his plans. You can go over a few more pages and we come to Genesis chapter 7. This is the son, this is when Isaac grows up. He marries Rebekah, and Rebekah has twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau would become the ancestor of the Edomite nation, and Jacob, of course, will become the ancestor of the Israelite nation. But Esau was the one who was born just shortly before Jacob. They were twins. Now, the time comes after some years where Isaac is ready to give a blessing to Esau, the oldest son, who is also Isaac's favorite son. Now, Rebekah overhears this, and she plans to deceive her husband so that Jacob, who is her favorite son, will receive the blessing. And the deceit is carried out, and Jacob does indeed receive the blessing which was intended for his older brother. Now, until very recently, I'd always looked at this account as a case of just outright deceit. Isaac's got his favorite, Rebekah has her favorite, and so there's almost a tussle between them, and you think the whole thing is just not a very good example of family relationships. However, a couple of weeks ago, I was reading an account which put a very different perspective upon this. Now, if you notice Genesis chapter 25 and verse 23, notice what God's plan was for the two children, Esau and Jacob. God says there, Genesis 25 verse 23, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body, and one people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. That's not the normal case. Usually the older gets the preferential treatment, but here God says it's going to be the other way around with your twins. Now, Esau turns out to be rather a weak character. We read in Genesis chapter 25, verse 29 and onwards, how Esau gives up his birthright as the firstborn just for the sake of a plate of food. He could have made some food for himself, but he doesn't. In the book of Hebrews, in the New Testament, Esau is described as godless. Over in Genesis chapter 26 and verse 34, you've got this statement: when Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Abraham had made sure that Isaac, his son, would not marry one of the local Canaanites, one of the Canaanite tribes being the Hittites, and so he sent all the way to the north to find a wife from his own extended family. And yet in the next generation, Esau goes ahead and marries 2 Hittite women of the land of Canaan. And so he wasn't much concerned about the spiritual implications of that. So really, Esau does not show himself as a very strong character. Now, the fact is, particularly in view of God's promise, that Isaac, in insisting on blessing his son Esau as the firstborn, was going against God's prediction, which said that the older would serve the younger. In other words, Jacob, the younger, would actually be the higher ranking. And over here in Genesis chapter 27, from verse 27 onwards, you've got Isaac, and Isaac is nearly blind. He can't see really at all. And he thinks he's blessing blessing Esau. And look at the blessing he pronounces. Verse 28, "Now may God give you of the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and the abundance of grain and new wine. May people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be master of your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you." So that seems to look ahead down the generations. But what's he saying here? May you be the master of your brothers. May you be number one. Who? Esau. But that's not what God had said back earlier. He said Jacob would be the primary one. So, yes, we look at Rebekah and say, well, she was doing the wrong thing. But really, Isaac was planning on the wrong thing as well. Isaac was planning to go against God's prediction. And so when Rebekah steps in and deceives her husband into giving Jacob the blessing, really that fits in with what God had intended. Now, I'm not saying the Bible encourages wives to deceive their husbands. It just so happens that this does work out as God had planned. But what you see is a mother again acting on behalf of her child. Now, there's various other examples, and I'm not sure how late we started, but I'm trying to keep within the time frame. Bathsheba, okay, I'll take the one of Bathsheba. We go over to 1 Kings chapter 1 in the Old Testament. And actually that's where the account is. But first let me start with a reading from 1 Chronicles 22 here. 1 Chronicles 22, and I'll read from verse 8. This is David describing what God had said and promised. 1 Chronicles 22 and verse 8. But the word of the Lord came to me. So this is David speaking, King David. You have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed so much blood on the earth before me. So this is God speaking to David, saying, you're not the one who is going to build a temple for me. Verse 9, God still speaking here. Behold, a son will be born to you, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side, for his name will be Solomon, and he will give peace and quiet to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name, and he shall be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. So God himself says to King David that Solomon is going to be the next king. And when we look in 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 17, we find that David at some point had made his wife Bathsheba aware of that promise. David had a number of wives, and that's the situation that did exist in those days. But this wasn't just a matter of earthly rule, of Solomon being an earthly king. There was what we call a messianic element to this, in that God was saying to David, and he does so several times, that through Solomon your kingdom will be established forever. And we know from the New Testament that that's pointing ahead to Jesus Christ, who would reign on the throne of David. But when David becomes old, another of his sons by another wife, a son named Adonijah, tries to seize the throne. And you read of that of 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 5 and following. Adonijah was David's son by another wife, Haggith. Adonijah was born before Solomon, and so putting aside God's promise, then Adonijah could say, well, look, I'm older than Solomon, I'm more entitled to the throne. But also there was, well, I'll just say Adonijah was spoilt. You see this statement in 1 Kings chapter 1 verses 5 and 6. Now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. So he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen with 50 men to run before him. And his father had never rebuked him at any time by saying, why have you done so? His father never challenged Adonijah. Adonijah got away with whatever he wanted to do. And so now he wants to be king. And as I say, he's older than Solomon, so in his mind, Adonijah has a right to be king, and he goes ahead to try to take the throne for himself. Now, from verse 11 of 1 Kings onwards, you have Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and the prophet Nathan acting together to prevent this. And once more you could say, well, this is simply one mother's jealousy over the son of somebody else, of Adonijah's mother. But remember what I said, that there was in all of this God's plan for the eventual Messiah. So a mother, Bathsheba, acts on behalf of Solomon to ensure that the throne does become his. Because that was the will of God, and it was the will of David as well. And David was the king to decide that. Now, we could go on here, but as I say, I'm trying to keep within time frame. There's a couple of other examples. One is the Shunammite woman in the time of the prophet Elisha. Another one is the Syrophoenician woman who comes to Jesus asking Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. So we've got a number of cases in the Old Testament and the New Testament of mothers acting in defense of their children. Now, I'm not implying here that it's only mothers who care for their children. Obviously, fathers care for their children as well, and in the New Testament, for instance, during the time of Jesus' earthly ministry, you've got the official whose son was seriously sick in Capernaum. He comes to Jesus, asking Jesus to help his son. You've got Jairus, whose daughter was at the point of death and comes to Jesus to get Jesus' help. You've got the father of the demon-possessed boy who begged Jesus to heal his son after Jesus came down from the Mount of Transfiguration. So fathers do care for their children as well. But what's my point? Well, today is Mother's Day, so I am speaking especially to mothers. And let's just go over to Titus chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, very briefly there to get the message. Titus chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. Older women likewise are to be reverent in their behaviour, not malicious gossips, nor enslaved to much wine, teaching what is good, so that they may encourage the young women to love their husbands, to love their children. So one of the things that mothers are called to do is to love their children. And love, of course, is expressed in many ways, and that includes caring for children, helping children, looking after children, seeking medical help for children, and so forth. But I want to speak today of another aspect of care. And that is, if you care for your child and your children, you care for their salvation. As a Christian parent, you care for your children's salvation. Society is full of all sorts of negative influences, and your children are being influenced by those negatives. They have been influenced from the time they went to preschool or daycare, and they will continue to be influenced right through to high school and on to university, if they go on to university, or to TAFE. And there will be influences pushing your children away from God, away from Christ, away from the Bible, away from Christianity, away from the church, away from salvation. And those influences includes such things as teaching about modern social attitudes. And this begins in preschool, and they're taught about things like same-sex marriage and so-called gender fluidity and all of this. The schools down to preschools are being used to promote these views. You've got the media, TV, radio, the internet, books, magazines, movies, the theatre. You've got the attitude expressed by your children's friends and also by your own extended family, that you'll have relatives perhaps who aren't interested in God and who will influence your children. You've got false doctrinal views coming from some churches. You've got false values in advertising. And one that gets talked about a lot is the sexualization of young girls promoted in advertising. You've got the extent and the availability of pornography on the internet. If you've got a computer, you have anything and everything being fed into your house by means of your computer, and the list of influences goes on. But if we are concerned about our children, if we care for our children, then we will want to guide them in the right direction, and we will want to protect them and strengthen them in regard to the negative influences that are impacting upon them. If you have a child, negative influences are impacting upon them now. It's not something that will happen. It's already happening. And indeed, it began when your child was quite young. Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6 says this, "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he grows older, he will not abandon it." So this raises the point of taking steps early in your child's life to guide them in the right direction. Let me read to you this statement. I've had it for many, many years. Some parents say, "We will not influence our children in making decisions in matters of religion." In other words, some parents say, "I'm not going to push my children in any direction. I'll let them do it themselves." Well, if you say that you're not going to influence your children, the advertisements will, the press will, the movies will, the neighbours will, the forces of sin will, the politicians will. In other words, everybody else is influencing your children. We use our influence over flowers, vegetables, animals, and so forth. Shall we ignore our own children? May God forgive us if we do. You weed your garden, or you let your husband, or the husband lets his wife weed the garden, whichever it will be. Well, what about the weeds, the negative influences affecting your children? You who are mothers may well spend years helping, guiding, praying for, and even worrying about your children. You spend sleepless nights looking after them as babies, and you can spend sleepless nights long after they cease to be babies. You help them through numerous problems as they grow older. You continue to be concerned for them when they marry and have children of their own. You worry about their health, you worry about their education, you worry about who they will date, you worry about who they will marry. But don't lose sight of their spiritual and their moral development. Be aware of all the influences that can lead your children astray, and take steps to overcome those influences. Especially be aware of the power of the computer. And if you don't keep a check on what they're watching all sorts of things. They're being influenced at school. They're being influenced constantly. And we as parents have a duty to be aware of how their thoughts, how their attitudes are being shaped. So this is a plea to mothers to do what mothers have done down through the centuries, which is to care for your children and protect them in every way that you can. Help them to face up to those things which will misguide them. And may God bless you in that. And for we who are fathers, then we need to work alongside mothers to act for the good of our children. It's not just a responsibility for mothers alone. It's a responsibility for parents. It's a big challenge, but it has eternal results. Let's stand and sing.